let's take a look at the midline of the brain. And if you remember, we've got the falx that divides. Here's the face. Sorry, I keep switching sides on you. So we've got the falx that runs anterior, posterior, underneath the sagittal suture. And you can see in this model the superior sagittal sinus and the inferior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus. You can also see the corpus callosum, that highway that connects left and right hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, helps them communicate with each other. And then you're also looking at the lateral wall, the inside of the lateral wall of the third ventricle, which is the thalamus. So the third ventricle sits in the center of the thalamus. And the floor of the third ventricle is the hypothalamus. Dangling off that anterior floor of the third ventricle, kind of that snout, so to speak, is where the pituitary gland would be. And then if we went posterior, so the posterior floor of the third ventricle, or roof, however you want to look at it, is the pineal gland. So we get the pineal gland in the back and the pituitary gland in the front. And just to remind you from the previous video, the membranes and ventricles video, we talked about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and I want to be sure to include that here. The hypothalamus is a control center for the autonomic nervous system, and it helps to also send messages as part of that to secrete certain messages to the endocrine system and to different glands to secrete different hormones. So the pituitary gland is one of the glands that gets messages from the hypothalamus, and it tells it what to secrete and how much to secrete. The thalamus, which sits on either side of the third ventricle, the thalamus is a big, huge sensory relay center. And essentially, all sensory information before it goes to the cortex has to pass through the thalamus first. And the thalamus acts as this gatekeeper, and it decides whether or not the information is important enough to move on to the cortex, and if it is, what part of the cortex it needs to be sent to. It's also, the exception to this is the olfactory nerve. So the olfactory nerve is the only sensory information that doesn't first pass through the thalamus before it goes to the cortex. It does eventually go to the thalamus, but it hits the cortex first and then goes to the thalamus. So if you ever need to know that for trivia, there you go. I also want to show you the fourth ventricle. We talked about the fourth ventricle sitting between the pons and the cerebellum. And you can see, let me get my angles correct. All right, so there you've got the space between the back of the pons and the front of the cerebellum. That space is the fourth ventricle. And you can imagine the occiput wraps around that back portion, so the cerebellum sit beneath the midline of the tent, that horizontal midline of the tent, nestled into the occiput bone. So the occiput wraps around, cerebellum sits beneath the horizontal midline, and between the cerebellum and the pons sits the fourth ventricle. The other thing I want to point out to you is the third ventricle. So we talked about the third ventricle being inside the temporal lobe. So let's get, here we are looking at the lateral side. Here's the face. So the lateral side of the cortex. And we have, so I've taken this off. Now you're going to see the inside view there you have that inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle runs inside the temporal lobe of the brain. All right, that concludes our tour of the brain. Hopefully you have a better sense of how the structures are arranged and a little better idea of some of the functions so that you can, once again, have a more in-depth conversation with the body. Thanks for watching.